What kind of man freezes when a 7-year-old girl simply asks him a question? The night Daniel Kong walked into Varelli's steakhouse in Beverly Hills, every conversation softened into a hush, as if the air itself recognized power before people did. The kind of power that moved markets, erased problems, and built empires out of silence and steel. His tailored charcoal suit sharp enough to reflect the chandelier light above. His presence measured in quiet control rather than noise, flanked not by visible force but by the kind of reputation that made men straighten their backs and women lower their voices without being told. A dinner here cost more than most families spent in a week, and yet to him it was just another Tuesday, just another table waiting, just another transaction in a life where everything had a price except the things he had already lost. And then, something disrupted the rhythm, something small, something that didn't belong in this polished world of glass and gold, a child's voice, clear and unfiltered, cutting through the curated calm like a question no one had prepared for. "Why are you staring at my mom?" The room didn't gasp, it didn't react loudly. It simply stopped, forks paused midair, wine glasses hovering inches from lips, a silence that stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable, because the question wasn't loud, it wasn't rude in tone, it was innocent, dangerously innocent, the kind of innocence that doesn't understand hierarchy, doesn't recognize wealth, doesn't bow to power, and that was exactly why it landed like it did. Daniel's eyes, dark and unreadable, had been fixed on the woman in the corner before the words even reached him, Naomi Carter, dressed in a standard black server uniform, fabric worn thin at the edges, the kind issued to employees earning just above minimum wage, her posture careful, her movements precise, trained to be invisible in a room designed for people like him. But she hadn't been invisible, not to him, not tonight, because something about her, no, something about the child beside her, refused to blend into the background. Amara Johnson stood there, small frame, steady gaze, her hand loosely holding onto her mother's sleeve, her eyes not afraid, not curious, just certain, as if she had every right to ask, as if the question itself belonged in the space more than he did. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Kong did not respond immediately. He didn't dismiss, didn't correct, didn't even look away, because in that fraction of a second, something unfamiliar slipped through the armor he had spent decades perfecting. Not fear, not anger, but recognition. A flicker so brief it could have been imagined, except it wasn't, because his body reacted before his mind caught up. A stillness. A pause that no one around him understood but everyone felt. Naomi quickly stepped forward, her voice low, apologetic, pulling Amara back as if trying to rewind the moment before it fully formed. "I'm so sorry, sir," she didn't mean. But Daniel didn't hear the rest, because his attention had already shifted, not to the apology, not to the room, but to a small detail resting against the child's chest, a cheap silver necklace, no more than $15, catching just enough light to reveal 2 engraved letters. Am, and suddenly, the past. Something buried, something he had sealed away. Pressed against the present with a quiet force that didn't ask permission, and for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the room wasn't thinking about control or business or dominance. He was thinking about a memory he wasn't ready to face. And that was the moment everything began to change. The manager's heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor as she approached, her expression already tightening into something rehearsed and cold. The kind of smile that did not reach the eyes. The kind designed to remind people exactly where they stood in a place like this. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice controlled, but edged with impatience, and before Naomi could respond, before she could even gather the right words to soften the situation, the manager's gaze shifted briefly to Amara, then back to Naomi's uniform, and that was enough for her to decide everything she needed to know. "Take your break in the back if you cannot manage your child," she added, lowering her voice just enough to avoid drawing attention, yet loud enough for the nearest table to hear, and then came the sentence that landed heavier than it sounded. "People like you do not belong in the dining area during service." Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around Amara's hand, her posture folding inward just a little, not out of guilt, but out of habit, the habit of survival, the habit of not escalating situations that could cost her the only job keeping their small apartment in South Central Los Angeles paid at roughly $900,000 equivalent per month. the habit of choosing silence over pride. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady but soft, and she began guiding Amara away, her steps careful, almost invisible, just like she had trained herself to be. But Amara did not move immediately. She lingered for half a second longer, her eyes still fixed on Daniel Kong, and there was something about that look that refused to dissolve. Not defiance. Not fear, but recognition without context, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle that no one had explained to her yet, and Daniel noticed it. He noticed everything, the way the child did not shrink under pressure, the way Naomi's shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with tonight, the way the necklace rested against Amara's chest, catching the light again as she turned slightly, and the engraved letters seemed sharper now, clearer, and suddenly the room felt smaller, quieter, like the edges of his control were tightening inward. But the manager continued, unaware or unconcerned with the shift unfolding just a few steps away. "We expect professionalism here," she said, her tone now directed entirely at Naomi. "Guests pay over 1,000,000 for a meal in this room. They do not come here to be disturbed." A few customers nodded subtly, others pretended not to listen, but the judgment lingered in the air, subtle yet suffocating. And still, Daniel said nothing. Not yet, because something inside him was rearranging. Slowly, unwillingly. A memory pressing forward but not fully formed. And Naomi, sensing the attention, lowered her gaze further. "It will not happen again," she murmured, pulling Amara gently this time, and now the child moved, but not before one last glance. One last look that lingered just long enough to leave a mark, and then they turned, disappearing toward the narrow hallway that led to the staff area. A space hidden from the elegance of the dining room. A space where people like them were meant to exist unseen, and only when they were gone did the room begin to breathe again, conversations resuming, silverware clinking softly, the illusion of normalcy restoring itself piece by piece. But Daniel Kong remained still, his eyes no longer scanning the room, no longer calculating deals or reading power dynamics, but fixed instead on the empty space where they had stood just moments ago. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, not anger, not control, but doubt. A quiet, persistent doubt that did not belong in his world, and it began with two simple letters he could not ignore. Daniel Kong did not sit down immediately, even though the host was already waiting beside the table reserved under his name. Even though the room had returned to its polished rhythm as if nothing had happened. Because something had happened, something small, almost invisible to everyone else. But to him it felt like a thread had been pulled from a place he had carefully sealed years ago, and once a thread is pulled, the fabric does not stay the same. His fingers hovered briefly over the back of the chair before he finally lowered himself into it, slow, deliberate, but not entirely controlled. His gaze drifting not to the menu placed before him, not to the crystal glass filled with water measured precisely to the brim, but back toward the hallway where Naomi and Amara had disappeared, and for a moment, the distance between a man who controlled millions of dollars and a child wearing a 15,001 necklace felt smaller than it should have been. Too small, uncomfortably small. He reached for the glass, lifted it halfway, then paused, because the reflection in the water caught something his mind had not yet organized. The letters AM, sharp, deliberate, not decorative, not random, engraved with intention, and his memory did not ask permission before stepping forward this time. It simply surfaced, uninvited and incomplete. A fragment of sunlight through a window in Seoul many years ago. A small hand gripping the edge of a table, a voice laughing softly. A name spoken without fear, Ariana Moon. The sound of it felt distant, almost unfamiliar, and yet the weight of it pressed heavily against his chest. He placed the glass back down without drinking, his jaw tightening slightly as if the act could hold the memory in place, but memories do not follow commands. They move where they want, and this one moved toward the necklace, toward the child, toward the question that had not left his mind since it was asked. "Why are you staring at my mom?" It had not sounded like a challenge. It had sounded like a truth waiting to be acknowledged. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his posture still composed, but his focus no longer aligned with the present moment. The voices around him blurred into background noise. A conversation about investments, another about property values measured in billions of won, all of it distant, irrelevant, because his attention had narrowed to a single detail he could not dismiss. And that was when he noticed something else, something smaller than the necklace but more precise, the way the child had held Naomi's sleeve, not out of fear, but out of familiarity, the kind of connection built over time, not circumstance. And yet there had been a hesitation in Naomi's reaction. A fraction of a second where her hand tightened just a little too quickly, as if protecting something or someone, not from danger, but from recognition. Daniel exhaled slowly, controlled, but not steady, because the pieces did not align the way they should. If the child belonged to that woman, the details would have settled into place naturally. But they did not, they resisted, and that resistance was what unsettled him most. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, retrieving his phone with a movement so subtle it did not draw attention, and without looking away from the hallway, he sent a single message, short, direct. Run a full background check on Naomi Carter and the child. No assumptions, no delays. He did not wait for confirmation, he did not need to, because when Daniel Kong gave an order, it moved before the words even settled, and still, even as control began to reassert itself through action. The question remained, not about the woman, not about the child, but about himself. Why had he stopped? Why had a simple question held him in place? Why did two engraved letters feel heavier than they should? And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Kong realized that he was not looking at them because they did not belong in his world. He was looking because something about them had once been part of it, and he had not yet decided whether he was ready to remember why. The hallway behind the dining room was narrow, dimly lit, and carried the quiet hum of a world that existed just out of sight from the polished elegance outside. A place where footsteps were faster, voices were lower, and people like Naomi Carter were allowed to breathe again. Even if only for a few minutes, she crouched slightly to meet Amara's eyes, her hands gently adjusting the child's jacket, as if fixing something small could restore balance to a moment that had already shifted too far. "You cannot say things like that in there?" she whispered, not harshly, not angrily, but carefully, as if choosing each word with the precision of someone who had learned the cost of being misunderstood. Amara tilted her head, her expression not defensive, not apologetic, but genuinely confused. "But he was staring," she said simply, her voice soft but certain, and Naomi paused, because the child was not wrong. She had seen it too, that stillness, that pause that did not belong to a man like Daniel Kong. A man known for decisions made quickly and without hesitation. A man who did not freeze, did not linger, did not look twice. And yet he had. Naomi's fingers lingered on the edge of Amara's sleeve for just a second longer than necessary. Then she let go, standing up slowly, her posture returning to the version of herself the world expected. Composed, invisible, controlled. "Sometimes people look for reasons we do not understand," she replied, her tone gentle, but there was something beneath it, something unspoken, something that Amara could not name but could feel, and children often notice what adults try to hide. Amara nodded, but her eyes drifted downward, toward the necklace resting against her chest, her small fingers brushing over the engraved letters without thinking. A habit she did not even realize she had. A quiet gesture repeated so many times it had become part of her. Naomi noticed it instantly, and for a brief moment, something flickered across her face. Not fear, not panic, but memory, sharp and unwelcome. She reached out, her hand hovering as if to stop the motion, then hesitated, pulling back instead, because stopping it would draw attention, and attention was the one thing she had spent years avoiding. "Do you remember what I told you about that necklace?" Naomi asked softly, her voice steady but lower now. Amara looked up, thinking for a moment, then nodded. "You said it belonged to someone important?" she answered, and Naomi smiled faintly, a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Yes," she said, "and it still does." There was a weight in those words, something heavier than the sentence itself, but Amara did not question it. Not yet, because to her, the necklace had always been there, just like Naomi, just like the small apartment they returned to every night, just like Marcus, who would be finishing his shift at the garage around this time. His hands stained with grease, his voice always calm, always steady, the kind of presence that did not demand attention but provided something stronger, something chosen, something consistent. Naomi straightened fully, her expression settling back into the neutral calm she wore like armor. "Stay here for a few minutes," she said, gesturing toward a small bench near the staff lockers. "I need to finish my shift." Amara nodded again, obedient, but her gaze drifted once more toward the direction of the dining room. as if the question she had asked was not finished, as if something about that man still did not make sense. And as Naomi turned to leave, walking back toward the bright lights and quiet expectations of the restaurant floor, she did not look back, because if she did, she might see something she had spent 7 years trying to keep buried. And in the dining room, Daniel Kong was still sitting exactly where she had left him. His phone now resting face down on the table, his untouched glass of water reflecting the chandelier above, and for a man who controlled everything around him, the one thing he could not control at that moment was the feeling that the past had just walked back into his life without asking permission. The message did not take long to return. It never did when it came from Daniel Kong, because the kind of network he operated within did not rely on time, it moved ahead of it, and yet when his phone vibrated once against the polished table, he did not reach for it immediately. He let it sit there for a second longer than necessary, as if delaying the answer could somehow delay the truth behind it, but eventually his hand moved, precise and controlled, lifting the device just enough to read. Without drawing attention, a short report, clean, efficient, and already unsettling in its absence of clarity. Naomi Carter, age 26, no criminal record, employment history fragmented, multiple short-term jobs across Los Angeles, no consistent medical documentation, no official birth record connected to the child, Amara Johnson, estimated age 7, school enrollment verified, but documentation incomplete, no hospital record matching Naomi as the biological mother. Daniel's eyes did not widen, his expression did not change, but something inside him shifted again. Not a break, not yet, but a pressure building in a place he rarely allowed uncertainty to exist. He read the lines once, then again, slower this time, not looking for confirmation, but for contradiction, because something about the simplicity of the report felt wrong, too clean, too empty, as if the most important part of the story had been deliberately erased. And that was when his mind moved in the direction it always did when information did not align, toward control, toward conclusion, toward judgment. If the records did not connect, then there was only one logical explanation: the child did not belong to that woman, and if that was true, then the question was not why the child had spoken, but why the woman had stayed silent for so long. Daniel placed the phone back down, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, and for the first time since the moment began, a familiar thought surfaced, clear, structured, decisive. She took the child, not with force, not violently, but deliberately, quietly, hidden within the kind of system that fails to notice people like her. And suddenly the necklace made sense, not as a coincidence, but as a trace, a piece of something that had been taken, something that did not belong where it now rested. Daniel's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the hallway this time, but inward, reconstructing the narrative in a way that restored his sense of control, because uncertainty was not something he tolerated for long. And yet even as the conclusion formed, something resisted it, a detail that refused to settle into place, the way the child had looked at Naomi, not with distance, not with confusion, but with trust, complete and unquestioned, the kind of trust that could not be fabricated, the kind built over years, not months. And that detail did not fit the story he was creating. It disrupted it. Quietly but persistently, Daniel exhaled slowly, his thumb brushing once against the edge of the phone before he sent another message, this time more specific. I want hospital records from 7 years ago, private clinics, unregistered cases, anything connected to the name Ariana Moon Kong. The name did not feel foreign when he typed it. It felt heavy, familiar in a way he had not allowed himself to acknowledge in years. And as the message disappeared from the screen, so did the certainty he had just built, replaced once again by something far more dangerous: doubt, not about the woman, not about the child, but about himself, about the decisions he had made, about the things he had chosen not to see, because if the child was connected to that name, even indirectly, then this was not a coincidence, it was a consequence, and consequences have a way of returning when you least expect them. Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture still composed, but no longer effortless, because now there were two possibilities, and neither of them gave him control. Either Naomi Carter had taken something that belonged to him, or she had protected something he had failed to keep, and for the first time that night, Daniel Kong did not know which outcome unsettled him more. The second message came faster than the first, almost immediate, as if the past had been waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. And when Daniel Kong picked up his phone this time, there was no hesitation, no pause to delay what he already felt approaching, because something inside him had shifted from curiosity into anticipation, not the kind that comes with control, but the kind that comes when you realize you might have been wrong for far too long. The report was longer now. Less clean, less certain. Fragments pulled from places that were not meant to be connected. 7 years ago, Los Angeles. A private medical visit under an unregistered alias, female patient, Korean origin. Approximately 22 years old, no official admission record, no discharge summary, only a note flagged and archived. Infant stabilized and released to third-party caregiver. Daniel's eyes stopped there, not moving forward, not needing to, because the words did not just inform him, they confronted him, stabilized and released, not abandoned, not lost, released, which meant someone had made a decision, someone had chosen who the child would go to, and suddenly the story he had constructed began to fracture. Not completely, not yet, but enough to let something else through, something quieter, something far more difficult to face, the possibility that Naomi Carter had not taken anything at all, that she had been entrusted with it. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened slightly, the only outward sign that something inside him had shifted again, and then his eyes moved to the next line, the one that should have been simple but was not, caregiver identity unconfirmed. No legal documentation, no financial trail, no follow-up, and that absence, that deliberate lack of trace, did not suggest carelessness, it suggested protection, intentional, calculated, and suddenly the image of Naomi. Standing in that hallway, adjusting her daughter's jacket with careful hands, did not look like concealment anymore. It looked like responsibility, and Daniel leaned back slowly. His breath steady but deeper now, because the difference between those two interpretations was not small, it was everything. If she had taken the child, then he knew exactly what to do. The world he controlled had clear answers for that kind of situation. But if she had been chosen, if someone he once trusted had placed that child in her hands, then this was not about control, it was about understanding something he had never fully seen. His mind moved quickly, not in confusion, but in reconstruction. 7 years ago, Ariana Moon Kong had disappeared from his world. Not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, like something removed rather than taken. He had accepted that version of events because it allowed him to continue, because questioning it would have required him to look at things he had chosen to ignore, and now those choices were returning, not as accusations, but as evidence. Daniel's thumb hovered over the phone again. But this time he did not send a command, he did not ask for more information, because for the first time that night, the next step did not come from his network. It came from something else, something far less predictable. He stood up, slowly, deliberately, the chair sliding back just enough to draw a glance from the nearest table, but not enough to disrupt the room. His presence still controlled, still composed, but no longer stationary, because sitting there had given him information, but it would not give him answers, and answers were no longer optional, they were necessary. Daniel adjusted his jacket with a subtle motion, his gaze already shifting toward the hallway where Naomi and Amara had gone. But this time, he was not looking for confirmation of a theory. He was looking for the truth behind it, and as he took his first step away from the table, leaving behind untouched food, untouched water, untouched certainty, one thing had already changed. He was no longer sure that he was the one who had been wronged, and for a man like Daniel Kong, that realization was far more unsettling than any answer he might find waiting beyond that door. The hallway felt different when Daniel Kong stepped into it, not because the lighting changed or the noise from the dining room faded behind him, but because for the first time that night, he was no longer entering a space as the most powerful man in it. He was entering as someone who did not have the full picture, and that shift, subtle but undeniable, followed him with every step he took, his shoes quiet against the narrow floor, his posture still composed, still controlled, but his focus sharper now, more precise, scanning not for threats, but for answers. And at the far end of the hallway, near a simple wooden bench, he saw her, Amara Johnson, sitting with her legs slightly swinging, her small hands resting in her lap, the necklace still visible against her shirt, catching just enough light to remind him why he was there. She looked up the moment he approached, not startled, not afraid, just aware, as if she had been expecting him without knowing why. And for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the distance between them filled not with tension, but with something quieter, something that did not belong to the world Daniel was used to navigating. "Are you still staring?" she asked, her voice calm, direct, the same tone she had used before, and Daniel paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer he would have given to anyone else did not apply here. "No," he said finally, his voice lower than usual, not softer, but more measured. I am trying to understand. Amara tilted her head slightly, considering his words in a way that felt older than her years. You look like you forgot something, she replied, and the simplicity of it landed deeper than it should have, because that was exactly what it felt like. Not that he had discovered something new, but that he had forgotten something important, something that had once mattered enough to leave a mark. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly to the necklace again, then back to her face. Where did you get that? He asked, his tone careful, not demanding, not commanding, just asking, and that alone would have surprised anyone who knew him. Amara looked down at the necklace as if seeing it for the first time, her fingers brushing over the engraved letters. My mom gave it to me, she said, then paused, adding softly, she said it belonged to someone who needed it more than she did. Daniel felt the words settle in a place he could not ignore, because they did not sound like something invented. They sounded like something remembered, passed down, protected, and before he could ask another question, a voice cut through the moment, firm, steady, and unmistakably protective. Step away from her. Daniel turned slowly, not startled, but aware, and saw Marcus Reed standing a few meters away, his posture solid, his expression calm but unyielding, the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice to make himself clear, his hands still marked from a day's work, his presence grounded in something far more real than the polished authority Daniel carried. She is not part of whatever business you have, Marcus continued, his gaze fixed directly on Daniel, not avoiding, not lowering, and that alone marked him as different, because most people adjusted themselves around Daniel Kong. But Marcus did not. Daniel studied him for a moment, not with irritation, not with dominance, but with interest, because this was not resistance born from ignorance, it was resistance born from certainty. I am not here for business, Daniel replied, his voice even controlled. I am here for the truth. Marcus's expression did not change, but there was a shift, small but noticeable, a tightening that suggested he understood more than he was willing to say, and that was when Daniel realized something else, something that had not been in any report, not in any data, not in any file. This man knew something, not just about the child, not just about Naomi, but about him, and for the first time since the night began, the power in the room did not belong entirely to Daniel Kong. It was shared, quietly, uneasily, between three people who were standing closer to the truth than any of them were prepared to admit. Marcus Reed did not move closer, but he did not step back either, his presence steady, grounded, the kind of stillness that came from knowing exactly what he was protecting, and Daniel Kong recognized that immediately, not as a threat, but as something far more difficult to deal with, conviction, the kind that could not be negotiated, could not be bought, and for a brief moment, the hallway held a silence that felt heavier than the one in the dining room, because this silence was not built on politeness, it was built on truth waiting to surface. Daniel's gaze shifted between Marcus and Amara, measuring, recalibrating, not for dominance, but for understanding. You know why I am here? Daniel said finally, his voice calm, controlled, but no longer carrying the same certainty it had earlier that night. Marcus exhaled slowly, not surprised, not defensive, just tired in a way that suggested this moment had been expected long before it arrived. I know what you think you are here for, Marcus replied, his tone even, but that does not mean you understand it. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Slightly, not in anger, but in focus, because the distinction mattered, and Marcus knew it. Then explain it, Daniel said, and the request itself was another shift, subtle but undeniable, because men like him did not ask for explanations. They demanded outcomes. Marcus glanced briefly at Amara, then back at Daniel, his decision made in silence. 7 years ago, Marcus began, his voice steady, measured. A woman came to us, not with money, not with power, but with something far more fragile, a child. Daniel did not interrupt, did not react outwardly, but every word landed with precision, aligning with the fragments he had already uncovered. She was exhausted, Marcus continued. Not physically, but in a way that told you she had been running from something she could not fight, and she knew she would not be able to keep running much longer. Amara listened quietly, her small frame still, her eyes moving between the two men as if sensing that something important was unfolding. Something that belonged to her even if she did not fully understand it yet. She did not ask us to take the child, Marcus said. She asked us to protect her, to give her a life where she would not be found, where she would not be pulled back into a world that had already taken too much. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not from disagreement, but from recognition, because the world Marcus was describing was one he knew intimately, one he had shaped, one he had benefited from. And you agreed, Daniel said, his tone quieter now, less about authority, more about confirmation. Marcus nodded once. We did, he replied, not because we understood everything, but because we understood enough. Daniel's gaze shifted briefly to Amara, then back to Marcus. And the woman? He asked, and this time, there was something beneath the question, something that had not been there before, not curiosity, not suspicion, but something closer to concern. Marcus held his gaze for a second longer before answering. She trusted Naomi, he said. More than anyone else, she knew Naomi would not treat that child as something temporary. She would treat her as her own. Daniel's breath slowed, controlled but heavier now, because the pieces were no longer resisting alignment, they were locking into place, and the picture they formed was not one he had expected, not one he was prepared for. She did not leave because she wanted to, Marcus added, his voice softer now. She left because she believed it was the only way to keep her daughter safe. The words settled in the air, daughter, and for the first time, Daniel Kong did not try to reshape it, did not try to control its meaning. He simply let it exist, and in that moment, the power he had carried into the hallway shifted again, not disappearing but changing, because this was no longer about what he could take. It was about what he had already lost without realizing it. And as he stood there, facing a man who had raised a child he had not known existed, and a child who had asked him a question he could not forget, Daniel Kong understood something that no report, no investigation, no network could have prepared him for. The truth was not something he could command. It was something he had to face, and it had been waiting for him for 7 years. The word lingered longer than it should have, not because it was unfamiliar, but because of how it had been spoken, not as a claim, not as a demand, but as a truth that had already existed long before Daniel Kong had stepped into that hallway, daughter. And for a man who had built his life on controlling definitions, controlling outcomes, controlling the way stories were told, this was the first time in years that a single word had slipped past all of that and settled somewhere he could not immediately reach. His gaze moved slowly from Marcus to Amara, studying her again, not as a possibility, not as a question, but as something real, something that had grown, lived, and become without him. And that realization carried a weight he had not anticipated, because it was not about what he had lost in a moment. It was about what had been missing over time, quietly, consistently, without interruption. What was her name? Daniel asked, his voice lower now, not commanding, not detached, but searching. Marcus held his gaze for a second, measuring the shift that had taken place, then answered simply, "You already know." And that was enough, because Daniel did know. He had always known. He had just chosen not to follow the question to its end. Ariana Moon Kong. The name did not echo this time. It settled, steady, undeniable, and with it came a memory that was no longer fragmented, no longer distant, but complete in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Her laughter, quiet but certain, her insistence on keeping things that mattered close, even when the world around her tried to take them away. The necklace, the initials M, not as decoration, but as a promise, something she had once told him without words, that what belonged to her would never truly be lost. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath measured, but heavier than before, because the distance between memory and reality had collapsed into a single point standing right in front of him. And yet, even now, there was something that did not fully align, something that resisted closure. His eyes shifted back to Marcus. "If she trusted you," Daniel said, "then why hide her from me?" The question was not sharp, not accusatory, but it carried something deeper, something that came from a place he rarely allowed himself to speak from. Marcus did not answer immediately. He looked at Amara first, then back at Daniel, and when he spoke, his voice did not rise, but it carried a clarity that cut through everything else. "Because it was not you she was afraid of," he said, and that alone was enough to shift the ground beneath Daniel's certainty. Because if it was not him, then it was something connected to him, something he had allowed, something he had not seen, and that realization did not come with anger. It came with Something far more difficult to process: responsibility. She knew your world, Marcus continued. And she knew that once her daughter became part of it, she would never have a choice again. Daniel's jaw tightened, not in resistance, but in recognition, because the truth in those words did not need to be explained. It only needed to be acknowledged, and for the first time he did not try to correct it. He did not try to defend himself against it. He simply stood there, absorbing it, allowing it to settle, because denying it would not change what had already happened. And then, before he could respond, before he could reshape the moment into something he could manage, Amara spoke again, her voice small, but clear, cutting through the tension with the same quiet certainty she had shown from the beginning. "Are you the person my mom was waiting for?" she asked, and the question did not sound like curiosity. It sounded like something she had heard before, something that had been said, in a different context at a different time, and now it was being repeated without fully understanding what it meant. Daniel looked at her, truly looked this time, not searching for resemblance, not searching for proof, but seeing her as she was, and in that moment the answer he had built his entire life around, the answer that had always been immediate, always clear, was no longer available to him, because this question did not belong to his world of certainty. It belonged to something else, something he had not prepared for, and for the first time, Daniel Kong did not have an answer, not because he did not know, but because the truth was no longer something he could say without first understanding what it would mean.